When you think about it, life is a series of presentations. With a background in athletics, the arts, and various leadership roles, I've had the opportunity to perform and present in a variety of different settings. In each of these spheres, I have learned to frame my presentation based on the audience. The audience is a vital part of each presentation, and who you are presenting to should be a driving force behind how and why you present. For example, it would make sense for me to perform a hip-hop routine at the halftime of a KU basketball game, but I would likely get my wrist slapped if I performed the same routine in front of a retirement community. Regardless of how polished and informative a presentation is, if it doesn't rise to meet the needs of the audience and capture their attention, the presentation will not be effective because the audience has no incentive to listen. Knowing your audience calls for presenters to consider the demographic of their audience, know what accommodations need to be made, and consider why the subject matter is of importance to the audience. One of the best ways to better understand your audience is to look at the demographic that will be in attendance. Consider the age, gender, academic background, socioeconomic status, race, marital status, and religious background of your audience when preparing for your presentation. This knowledge is not only helpful in connecting with your audience, but can also prevent you from making offensive comments. When presenting to teenagers whose lives are primarily digitized, the inclusion of an interactive activity involving technology would serve as an excellent way to capture that particular audience's attention. If you find that your audience is filled with mostly unmarried single women, a presentation on the perception of single women in the workplace might offend or create an off-putting atmosphere from the very beginning. Identities affect how we see the world around us, and how your audience sees themselves will affect how they see you. Another presentation technique that you can use to connect with your audience is making accommodations. When making accommodations, consider the venue, the audience, and the application. If the venue is large and your audience would thrive off of small group interactivity, arrange the presentation space to be more intimate. This can be accomplished by asking the audience to sit in the first few rows or positioning the seats in a U shape around the presentation space. Accommodations based off of the audience can include things from having speakers placed throughout the space so older or harder of hearing audiences can better understand what you're saying, or incorporating historical or societal examples based off of the era that the audience grew up in. The last thing to think about when considering accommodations is to consider what you want your audience to, The last thing to consider when making accommodations is how you want your audience to apply your material. This can be important because maybe you might need to make the accommodation of bringing notes in order for your students to take notes on what you're saying to prepare for an upcoming test. It can also be important if you wanted to pass out certain handouts in order for some business professionals to get a graph or some data onto how what you're saying can really help their own companies thrive. The last tip that I have for you today on how to connect with audiences is thinking about what you want your audiences to walk away with. What's in it for them? They're likely thinking, I've seen plenty of presentations on how to be successful or how to make my business thrive. So what makes yours different? Make sure that your material that you're talking about and your subject matter can be applied to the specific audience you're presenting for. Make sure that if you deal with business professionals, know going in that they likely have a time is money sort of attitude. So make sure that you are making their time valuable and making sure that your subject matter really does apply to what they are going to go into after they leave your presentation. Again, with knowing your audience, it involves knowing their demographic, knowing how they will be applying the material once you leave the presentation space, and what accommodations can go into you making your material really catered towards those individuals. You must really know your audience in order to be an effective presenter, so I hope my presentation today helped you learn how to get to better connect with your audiences.